Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I explore some vintage balaclava patterns, and I have 3 finished projects. I'll talk about the modifications I made, as well as how I solved some problems and overcame some mistakes. One of the projects had some strange sizing issues, so I'll also talk a bit about sizing and sizing standards. So let's get started. I was at Knitting Group the other day, and another knitter who collects vintage patterns asked if I had any patterns for balaclava. She's like, I know I can look on Ravelry and find, contemporary ones, but she was looking for something vintage. And I said, I knew for sure that I had some, and I invited her over. I said, because I have some books that are hard copy and some that are digitized, and we can kind of look through, and you could have some fun looking through the patterns and then seeing what it is that you might want to make. And I thought I would show you guys just the variety of balaclava or helmet patterns that were in books and booklets 120 years ago, because I found it fascinating. So let's go to the overhead, and I will show you my hard copy books and those patterns, and then we will look at the ones that are in digitized format. The first place I knew I would have a helmet was in this book right here. It's called the Handbook of Wool and Crochet. It was published by the Needlecraft Publishing Company in 1918. So Augusta, Maine was a place where a lot of publishing was going on. This is the book that I used to knit my World War I sweater when I was doing my project where I was knitting sweaters from each decade. And I knew that there was a section in this book because this is 1918 in knitting for the Red Cross. So this book has a variety. It has a variety of things to knit. There's socks, washcloth, sleeveless sweaters, hot water bottle cover. And then there's this one-piece helmet. So this one is worked partly flat, but then partly in the round, and it's all in one piece. But on the next page is this one right here. So it's a helmet made in 2 parts. So if you were a knitter who didn't knit in the round on double points, you could knit it flat and then seam it up the side. So that's the first example. This book is actually available on Project Gutenberg. So they have all of the original photos, and then the text has been scanned, and so it's not PDFs of the page, but it does have all of the text in there with the original images. The next book I thought of was this. This is Fleisher's Knitting and Crocheting Manuals. So there were a couple of companies that put out knitting manuals every year starting in around 1900. I do have the very first Fleisher's knitting manual, which was published I think in the 1890s sometime, and that was hard copy. But starting around 1900, Fleisher's and Columbia, which was another yarn company, both produced these soft cover books, and sometimes you'd see the same patterns in them year after year with some patterns removed and some others added. So in this book, we have this kind of helmet here. So this is what I would call like a basic balaclava. It's got a little bit of hangover over the back and the front. It's got ribbing around the neck to kind of pull it in, and then it surrounds the face. So that's a pretty basic helmet pattern. So I have another Fleisher's knitting manual. This is a reproduction copy that I got off a seller on Etsy, and because these are not in copyright, so she scanned them all and then she prints them and she binds them up. So this is, I think, from Iva Rose. So this is another one, and it's the same exact pattern in here again. This copy is the 6th edition, copyright 1906. This is the 8th edition, and this is, I believe, 1910 was when 1910 was when this one was done. And so this wasn't even in World War I yet. This is just winter wear for men. So this book is called Century Stitches, and it's all of the knitted items that were in this movie called Tell Them of Us, which told the story, it's a true story of a family in an English village who had Two of the brothers were sent off to World War I, and they required a lot of knitwear for the movie, and they got volunteer knitters from all over the world to help recreate these things. Sometimes they had to just figure things out by looking at photographs. Sometimes they had patterns, and what they decided to do was to turn this into a knitting book using modern pattern instructions, modern yarn recommendations. And so in here we'll see helmet for a serviceman. And again, it's got those flaps on the front and the back and that ribbing around the neck. This has got kind of an interesting stitch pattern. It's kind of a broken rib, so there'll be a few rows of ribbing and then some garter stitch. So it makes it a little bit more interesting for the knitter than just doing garter stitch, all garter stitch or all ribbing for the entire thing. I thought there was a good chance that I could find a helmet pattern in this book, or at least one of the books in this series. So this was a book published, it was a very popular book, published in the UK in 1940. There were 8 books in all that were published between 1940 and 1949. They all had very similar titles: Practical Knitting Illustrated, Practical Family Knitting Illustrated, Practical Home Knitting Illustrated, Knitting for All is, you know, just they reused the same words over and over in the titles. So I did find a balaclava in here. And so this one is an interesting stitch pattern here. That's a twisted rib pattern. So it's knit to purl one, but the knit stitches only on the right side are worked through the back, because this is knit flat back and forth. And so on the wrong side, you are knit 1 for the purl stitches and then just purl 2 for the knit stitches. And it comes down to the neck, but this is not necessarily meant for a soldier, although if you were knitting for your husband or your son or something who was serving in the war, then maybe you might send it. They're just not talking about the war directly in these books. It's all about family knitting. They're not talking about knitting for the war effort. They do mention how to conserve yarn or how to pull out yarn from an existing sweater and reuse it by combining it with other yarn or even fabric in some cases. They talk about a little bit about the scarcity, but they're not talking about the war directly for this pattern. Now, I also have a lot of books that have been digitized. One of them is called The Second Book of House, and it was published in the early 1900s, possibly 1902, based on some handwriting that was on one of the pages. What I like about this one, it's a little different, is that the ribbing is kind of done in sections to really hug the face. This one is a book that was published by Weldon's, and it was a book of hospital comforts. And so this one was published during the war, probably World War I. And on the cover, you can see that there's a helmet with some shoulder protection. And at the bottom, you can see that this is the first series of the hospital comforts and that their second series is now available. And that one has a helmet on the cover, and this one has ear openings, which is an interesting difference. This one is from the Columbia Book of Yarns, the 19th edition, published in 1918. This one has 2 different helmets in it. One of them has flaps for the chest and back, like we've seen before. But the other one is really interesting, I think. It has sort of full chest and back coverage, and then it buttons at the underarms. So it's really going all the way down. And that one's really interesting. I'll leave a link down in the show notes to that book, and it'll go right to the page where that is, because it's a pretty big book. And then the last one that I have is called Leach's Comforts for Men. It's another UK publication. It's probably published in the World War I era, based on a photo of a knitter that I can see early in the book. This one has ear openings as well, but it's actually ear flaps. So you can open them up so that you can hear better, or you can tuck them in order to keep warmer. So for all of these books, I will leave information down in the show notes on what those books are, and then links if they're available on archive.org or if they're actually still available in print, because one of those still is. So I mentioned a few weeks ago that I had been dragging my feet on finishing a couple of projects because there are these two sweaters for my grandniece and grandnephew, and I was just kind of putting the brakes on it because I didn't know what I was going to knit next. And that had never been an issue for me in my knitting life. I'd always had plenty of things and knew, and every time I saw something I liked, I'd start that and I'd end up with a lot of UFOs. And just over the past few years, getting rid of those UFOs, gradually working through them, the UFO pile vanished. And so I was just in this situation I'd never been in before. And so I've got quite a few things on the needles now, and a number of things that I have planned for as things come off the needles. I do have 3 finished things to show you today. And the first one is a little hat. So let's go to the overhead and I will tell you about that. So I don't have a whole lot to say about this hat. I wanted something quick and easy, and I also wanted to use up a skein of that variegated yarn that Arcane Fiberworks sent me a while back. And so I've been experimenting with different ways of using variegated yarn. And I know slip stitch patterns are a great way to use them because the slip stitches span multiple rows, and that can kind of break up the color. So there's not tons of pooling with Arcane Fiberworks yarns, but it can kind of clump together here and there in places. And so this really broke it up. So this is their DK weight yarn. It's a 80-20 superwash merino and nylon combination. They call it a DK. It's light worsted, so there's like 220 yards in 100 grams. And this is worked at a fairly firm gauge for the yarn weight in order to make it more wind resistant. Still plenty stretchy. I mean, it's totally stretchy. It was fun. One of the things I really liked about this pattern was the way the crown decreases were worked. So you can see that slip stitch pattern goes all the way up to the very top. So again, I'll leave a link down below to the pattern and also to Arcane Fiberworks. This colorway is called Crashing Waves. So I mentioned earlier that I had kind of put the brakes on a couple of projects because I didn't know what I was going to knit next. And 2 of those projects were sweaters for my grandniece and grandnephew, their brother and sister. I was just kind of stalling on it. And so I have finished those 2 projects. Let's go to Henry's sweater first, and I will show you what that looks like. And of course, I had an issue with the final finishing technique. And so I'll show you I'll talk through how I worked out that problem, and then the solutions that I tried, the various solutions I tried until I got the final result that I'm really pleased with. So I've talked about this sweater in a previous Casual Friday where I talked about wanting to compensate or take into account cable flare when I was binding off these shoulders and the front opening. So cable flare happens because you typically have a lot more stitches when you're working cabled fabric than you would if you were working in stockinette. So if you do something like bind off and you don't compensate for all of those extra stitches, that edge ends up being a lot wider because it has a lot more stitches than something this wide would be in stockinette. So when you're binding off and you have all those extra stitches, you can end up getting this flare. It's called cable flare. So I did some decreases at the shoulders and at the front before and as I was binding off to return the stitch count down to something that it would be if it was in stockinette. I have done a Technique Tuesday video on cable flare to talk about how to make these kinds of calculations, and I'll link to it down below. I'll also link to that previous Casual Friday video where I was talking about that, because I was also talking about how I compensated at the ribbing. Because ribbing, since it pulls in, can often make up for all of that extra room that the cable fabric is giving. But in this case, it was just so much fabric that I knew that the ribbing was going to bulge like it did in this sweater here. So if this were knit in stockinette, I would have used 70 stitches to get this width. This had 102. So 70 stitches to 102 is a lot. And so I compensated for that. I cast on 90 stitches, and then I did some increases in the last row of ribbing right before I was ready to work the cable pattern. So that was stuff I'd all done before. The thing that I hadn't done was sewn in this collar. You work just a rectangle of ribbing. You sew the cast on edge to the neck opening, and then you sew the two vertical edges of each side of each edge of the collar to the inside. And again, I suspected by looking at this photo that there was going to be an issue with that bind off edge. So when I sewed this cast on edge, that was about 16 inches worth. There was like about 5 inches on each side here. There was 5 inches across, and then there was some decreasing at the edge here that maybe gave a ½ an inch on each side. So there's about 16 inches of edges that this cast on edge had to be sewn to. But then you have to sew this vertical edge here, and that means that the bind off edge, which isn't as stretchy as a cast on edge, has to go all the way around. And it's just a farther thing. It has to cross over, and the bind off chain just isn't stretchy. And so I went ahead and sewed it in. I didn't sew the vertical edges. I just held them down. I could see it was too tight. It was just too tight. Bind off chains have a little bit of stretch, but not much, just because of their structure. There are a lot of different stretchy bind offs. And they will work to give you more stretch. I don't often like the way that they look, and this is something that needs to look nice when it's relaxed. And I didn't want to do a kind of bind off where you're adding yarn during the bind off process. So I elected I was going to do a sewn bind off. I thought I'd do two things. So my first reknit, I didn't actually reknit the whole collar. I left it sewn in, and I just ripped back about 1/3 of the length. And then I used a larger needle, just one size larger, and I reknit that 1/3. And then I started doing my the bind off that I was going to do. I was going to do what's called a half hitch bind off. Sometimes it's called outline stitch bind off, casting on cast off, or stem stitch bind off. It replicates the smooth side of the long tail cast on. So I started doing it, and then I realized that this collar was going to be flipped back, and that the way I was binding off, it was going to be the bumpy side showing, which is not what I wanted. I didn't think about it till later that I could have just taken out what I'd done, and I could have done this half hitch bind off purlwise so that on the back side you'd see the smooth. I didn't think of that. I also just didn't like the look of the larger stitches, and I wasn't convinced it was going to be enough stretch. I did a second retry. My second retry, I ripped out 2/3 of it. I wanted to only have 1/3 here, and the idea was to work some increases across the back in some way so that I would have more stitches on the needles when I was binding off, and that would make a longer edge. What I decided to do kind of on the back right before the shoulder seam was to increase on each side of a column of knit 2 stitches so that I would create a whole extra 4 stitch repeat on each side gradually. I'd do 1 extra stitch on each side, and then in the next right side row another extra stitch, and then so it would do it over the course of like 8 rows. I would create an extra 4 stitches on this side and an extra 4 stitches on that side. The idea is that it would look something like this. So I did that, and then once again I realized I had done it on the wrong side of the fabric, and what you were going to see instead was something that looked like that, and that is not what I wanted. I also decided that increasing 8 stitches on each side, so 16 stitches total, was just too much when I only had about 24 stitches or maybe 30 stitches across the back. That was just too much of an increase. And so what I decided to do was rip it out again so that I was down to a third of the length. And then I reknit it by doing 1 repeat extra on each side. What you'll see is that I increase it again over the course of 8 rows. So every time this was facing me, I would do an increase. And I created just 1 extra repeat just to the armhole side of these stitches, so that these were going straight across, and then right at that corner where the collar turns, that's really where you need the extra stitches because you're coming around a corner. And so that gave me the extra, and now I really like the way that it's laying, because without it even being on a kid before, it was just too tight looking, and this just has more room, and I think this is going to be better. So I'm really happy with this result. It didn't take a long time to redo each of these. And some of these were just bonehead mistakes that I made, but I'm much happier with the end result of this. And the last project that I want to show you is the sweater for my grandniece, Rosie. I loved this pattern the minute I saw it, but this also had some challenges in it, particularly the sizing and the choice of sizing. So let's go to the overhead and I'll show you this adorable little sweater. I can't wait to get a picture of my grandniece wearing this sweater because I love it so much. So this is a sweater that I knit for Rosie, who is the sister of Henry, getting the other sweater. I did make some modifications to this pattern, and they were different than what I did for Henry's. I didn't have to do anything to compensate for gauge changes. So you'll see here that we've got this cable pattern, then it switches to the moss stitch, and the designer compensated for that in this sweater. And by working decreases at the transition, there's a couple of right side purl rows here. And so decreases were worked to bring it down to the stitch count needed for this flat stitch pattern here. What I had issues with, or problems with, challenges with, was the sizing in this pattern. So these two patterns, these are the 2 patterns. You can see they're both from Ella Rae. One uses Cashmerino Sport and this one uses Cashmerino Aran. So they're from the same yarn company, and they were designed by the same designer. So you can see that, both of them have a schematic. They give the length measurements, they give you the finished circumferences. Well, they give you the finished width, and so this is they're supposed to be knit in pieces. So this says like the largest size is 15 3/4 inches across, which is 31.5 inches in circumference. And so you get some information about the length of the sleeve, nothing about the width or how deep that armhole is going to be. But at least you have some information about the finished size. And the same is true over here. And what you'll see here for measurements, these are chest measurements. So these are the actual measurements of the child. And these are the ages that these are supposed to be associated with. So it says a child 6 to 7 years old has a 28-inch chest, and then we already noticed that the finished size would be like 31.5. So the amount of ease that is given for each of these sizes is about 3 inches, maybe slightly more in the case of the largest size. And so there's 5 sizes. They start at 20 inches, they go up to 28, and they are in 2-inch increments. And so the sizes are ages 6 to 12 months, and then you have 1 to 2 years, 2 to 3, and then it jumps up 4 to 5, jumps up 6 to 7. Okay, so I was looking at those, and I didn't know what size my grandnephew was. His mom said he wears like a size, he was 4.5 this fall, but he wears like a size 6 or 7. He's a big kid. He's a tall, big kid. I'm like, okay. And then, but then I started looking at the Maeflower, and again, we have 5 sizes. They're in 2-inch increments. This one starts at 18 inches, going up to 26. And then the largest size is 15 inches across. So that's a 30-inch, finished size. So this one has like 4 inches of ease for this particular sweater for all the sizes. But now we take a look at the ages associated with those. 3 to 6 months, 6 to 9 months, 9 to 12. So these are 3-month increments. Then we get 6 months. So it's 12 to 18 months, and then 18 to 24 months. And so then I was looking at these sizes. I'm like, I'm pretty sure that when I had 2-year-olds, they did not have a 26-inch chest. And when you look at this one up here, the 26-inch chest is for a 4 to 5-year-old. And I thought there's no way that babies in 3 months will have a chest that goes up 2 inches. I just thought that was crazy. And my niece said that Rosie wears a size 2 toddler. So I was like, I want to go look at clothing sizes. So I looked at a bunch of things online. I looked at the Craft Yarn Council's standard measurements. I looked at clothing companies like Baby Gap and Old Navy and Children's Place, those things, to see what they were saying a child's chest should be. And this seemed really off. So I had my niece measure her kids. I said, measure their chest, measure how long you want it from their shoulders down, and then measure from their underarm to their wrist so that we can, figure out their sleeve size. And then I'll see what size. And so she sent me those measurements and said, but make sure you make them a little bit longer so that they, they can wear them longer, like maybe wear them next year as well. This was going to be a little big on Henry, but planning for next year, that was going to work out. So this sizing all worked out. This one, my niece or grandniece, who just turned 2 a couple of weeks ago, has a 20-inch chest. So 20 or 21, somewhere in there. So she absolutely did not need a sweater that was 30 inches in circumference with a 20-inch chest. She did, however, need this length that they had. So I think the lengths for here are all correct. The only thing I could think of was that they want to have 5 sizes for their patterns, and for some reason they want them in 2-inch increments, even though this is meant for a baby. So what I ended up doing was making the size around that correlated to this middle one, but making it to the length for the longest one. So that's the main modification I made. And what I realized was I was kind of doing some other calculations, because they don't say this explicitly, but I kind of gleaned this by looking at it. It looked like it's meant that the cable pattern goes up to the underarm, and then the rest of this up here is for the moss stitch, because this is intended to be worked flat in pieces. And so what I did for the body was I worked the body in one piece up, and then for the cabling, and then I separated for the 2 fronts and the back when I did the moss stitch. And then rather than knitting the sleeves flat and then sewing them in, I picked up stitches around here and knit them in the round going that way. And then I just reversed the shaping. So I did have to make one other modification. My row gauge was, even though I used the same yarn, my row gauge was a bit different. So I had to change the shaping rate, the frequency of when I was doing my decreases. I have a video on how to do that too. So if you're interested, I will leave that down in the show notes. So it's a really cute sweater. The knitting was actually straightforward once I got the sizing figured out. And then these buttons, we have a fabric store in St. Paul called Treadle Yard Goods. And there's a member of the State Button Society. These are people who collect buttons and they trade them and they sell them. And they have their buttons on consignment, and I love to always go there and choose buttons from there first if I can. So these are all mother of pearl, and they're all different. It came on a card of, I think there were 12 buttons, and I only needed to use 6 of them. These are futzy. They will go through the wash. This is a big pain to put through a buttonhole, and so what I'm going to tell my niece to do is I tried to put the roundest one up here, just unbutton it and treat it like a pullover. So you don't have to unbutton these buttons, because that will just drive you crazy if you have to do that. So that's the sweater. I just love this sweater. I love the color. I love the stitch patterns. I think it was worth the effort to try to figure out where things could go wrong in this and just do kind of a sanity check. And what I would recommend is, if you are knitting for a child, have the parent measure their chest, give a few key measurements. It's okay if it doesn't fit them perfectly. You know, you don't want it to be too small, but you want it to be in the ballpark. You want it to fit them well enough that they can wear it, and just do a reality check of actually measuring. I have always relied on the sizing in patterns for babies and children, particularly if I'm knitting for a child that isn't born yet, because in that case, you can usually say, well, it will fit them at some point, and hopefully it will fit them in the correct season. But if that child is alive in the world, have the parent measure their chest, their sleeve length, how long they want it to fit, just to give yourself a reality check on the sizing in the pattern. So when I was trying to solve this issue with sizing in these knitting patterns, I checked a variety of sources. So I started with the Craft Yarn Council's website. They publish a lot of standards that have to do with yarn and knitting and pattern writing and abbreviations, and they have some sizing charts. And a lot of hand knit designers do refer to the Craft Yarn Council's charts. They use those when they're grading their patterns. The Craft Yarn Council gets their information from ASTM International. ASTM used to stand for the American Society for Testing and Measurements, but now it's just called ASTM International, because it's not just for Americans, and it's standards for all kinds of things. But one of the things that they have standard sizing for is clothing. Nobody is required to use them, but a lot of people will, because it helps, you know, it's a good starting place, and then clothing manufacturers might tweak those. Knitwear designers will often use ASTM standards, and again, they'll tweak them for their own patterns and their customer base as they see fit. The ASTM standards are not free. They cost something. So I was checking clothing retailers and their size charts for their different clothing sizes, just a variety of things. And a lot of them were fairly close for different age ranges, but they didn't really agree 100%. But it was clear that that baby sweater pattern I had was way off compared to what all of these other size charts were. I had been curious about the ASTM standards for a long time, but I knew that they cost money, and you have to buy them by each set. So you can't just get all of the standards for all of the sizes for everyone from, you know, preemie babies up to extra large plus size adults. They're grouped. I bought 2 of the sets. I bought the one that was for preemies up to 24 months, and then I bought the one for little kids, which is ages 2 to 6. Those were the 2 that fit with my grandniece and grandnephew, but they also were the sizing charts that I tend to know the least about. And they had information that wasn't just for sweaters, but you know, it had all kinds of head measurements, neck measurements, different length measurements, things all the way down to the feet. It's literally head to toe, which I found really interesting. So I can't really show you everything, but let's go to the overhead and I will show you a bit about what these standards offer. And I will say, I don't remember exactly what I paid. I didn't pay the same amount for each of the standards that I bought. I think one of them I paid about $57 and the other one about $67. I looked to see if you could just buy like the complete set of everything to see what that would cost, because that would be handy to have for somebody who's interested in that and maybe wants to design one thing but size it up and down, you know, to do that grading. I couldn't find that. Apparently they used to do that, but they don't anymore. If somebody knows if it's possible to buy the whole set of ASTM standards and they know the secret link for that, please let me know down in the comments, because I'd be really curious about that. But I want to go to the overhead and just give you a taste of what the ASTM standards offer. These are the two standard tables of body measurements that I bought. This one is body measurements for children, infant sizes preemie to 24 months, and then this one is for the little kids. They have two charts. One has inches and the other one is metric. I thought this was interesting. They have these body forms on here, and you can see these different lines and how they correlate to different kinds of measurements. And then they give you all of these different measurements, like the average body weight, and then also the range. They have girth measurements, head girth, neck base girth, mid-neck girth, shoulder girth. This is the one that confused me the most. It has upper chest girth, chest bust girth, and upper chest bust girth. And so they have 3 different measurements in there. But if you look at the body forms, there are 2 of them. And so clearly this one is the upper one and this is the just chest bust girth. But is it the upper chest girth or is it the upper bust chest girth? It's like, what are these 3 measurements? That's something that's confusing. There's certain terms in these charts that I was unfamiliar with. Like they have vertical measurements and they have things like cervical height. And like, this is not a term that you can find in the dictionary. But I think that's basically the base of the back of the neck and then down to these different locations. I did find that there are some notes and they talk about definitions. And so for definitions relating to body dimensions, refer to terminology D5219. So I'm gonna see if I can find these. So I hope this was helpful to some of you out there, whether you are trying to design things and size them in multiple sizes, in which case I would recommend that whoever it is you're trying to design for, that you get a hold of the standards for those particular people, because I think that's really informative. Or if you're just trying to knit something for a particular person, a specific person, that you really do need to look at what the sizing information says and look at all of the pieces of information, not just, oh, this is supposed to fit a 4-year-old, but look at the chest measurement that they're saying, look at the schematic to show what the finished measurements are going to be, not just in circumference, but also in length, and then compare that to the actual child or person of any age that you're trying to knit for. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.